This last video on the reproductive systems is dedicated to this single slide. There's a slide that comes after this, but this is the most important slide, I believe, that will help you understand what's going on during the 28 days of the female reproductive cycle. You'll notice that there's three things that are lined up here. At the top you have the ovarian cycle. So we have just another representation of follicular development, ovulation, formation of the corpus luteum, then formation of the corpus albicans. In the middle panel, we have the uterine cycle. We have menstruation, proliferation, ovulation, what's called the secretory phase, which would be when implantation occurs, and then we're right back to menstruation again. You'll notice the days are lined up down here, so you can always see what day we're at. I added in these red bars to help us separate these days into the four phases: the menstrual phase, the preovulatory phase, ovulation on day 14, and the postovulatory phase. The bottom row shows the hormones. Now it shows just the four primary hormones. It shows FSH and LH are the solid colors, blue for FSH, orange for LH. The dashed arrows, since they're being produced by the ovaries, they're estrogen in green dotted line and progesterone in whatever color that is, maybe brown. So the solid represents the two hormones being released by the anterior pituitary. The dashed lines represent the two primary hormones produced by the ovaries. Now, what this doesn't show are the other two, relaxin and inhibin. But what I like to do is go through each phase one more time, but then ask yourself what hormones are responsible for what's going on either in the ovary or in the uterus. So let's start with the menstrual phase. It's called menstrual phase because of menstruation. And we see that what's occurring during menstruation is removal of the stratum functionalis. But the question I want you to answer is why? What causes that? Well, if we look down at the hormones, the cause of this menstruation is low estrogens and low progesterone. So those hormones are very low here. If we look up at the ovarian cycle, what's happening there? Well, we have follicular development, formation of a secondary oocyte. What is driving that? If we look down at the hormones, it's FSH. FSH is relatively high here. You'll notice it's low down here. So that answers the question based on hormones. What hormones are kind of in charge of those two processes that are occurring? Then we enter preovulatory phase, and notice that in the ovarian cycle, we're going to get a secondary oocyte mature into that Graafian follicle. Because of that, it starts to produce large amounts of estrogens. So we look down at the graph and notice what happens with the estrogen. It starts to climb because of that mature follicle. What does that estrogen do? It helps proliferate the endometrium. So during the preovulatory phase, we get proliferation of the endometrium. Towards the end of the preovulatory phase, we begin to see the incline of LH. We start to see the LH surge. That LH surge is because estrogen reached a certain level, and that high estrogen tells the anterior pituitary to begin producing more LH. When LH reaches a certain point, it triggers ovulation. So now we have that ovulation event, that release of the secondary oocyte into the fallopian tube. The empty follicle is called the corpus hemorrhagicum, and then it's going to collapse and form the corpus luteum. So after ovulation, what happens next? Well, after ovulation, progesterone starts to increase because of the corpus luteum. Estrogen begins to go back up again because of the corpus luteum. Relaxin begins to be secreted, and so does inhibin. So what occurs during post-ovulatory? Well, because of this high progesterone and because of this high estrogen, we keep growing and proliferating that endometrium. Because of high progesterone, more importantly, because of high estrogen and high inhibin, we get low FSH and LH. That low FSH and LH makes sure that we don't get continued follicular development. So no more follicular development during post-ovulation. Instead, we have corpus luteum, and we wait, and we wait, and somewhere around here, this timing, if we get HCG, human chorionic gonadotropin, the corpus luteum stays, and we don't get the corpus albicans. And if that occurs, progesterone stays high, estrogen stays high, relaxin stays, and inhibin stays. This graph doesn't show that. So this graph represents if fertilization does not occur. Because if fertilization does not occur, progesterone levels will drop, estrogen levels will drop, and you get formation of the corpus albicans. And if you get formation of the corpus albicans, you get menstruation because of the low progesterone and low estrogen. Now, a couple points to make. There's medications that can abort a pregnancy. Those medications are progesterone blockers. They're progesterone antagonists. So if we need to induce an abortion, you block progesterone. Progesterone is a pregnancy promoter. If you block it, the pregnancy is no longer being promoted. There's also birth control. Now, birth control is different. Birth control is not going to abort, it's going to prevent. And birth control is largely a combination of progesterone and estrogen. But it mimics this situation. It mimics post-ovulatory. Because if you give high progesterone orally or some other delivery mechanism and estrogen, it keeps FSH and LH low. So this is the whole point of birth control, keeping FSH and LH low. Because if you keep these two hormones low, you will not get maturation of follicles and you will not get ovulation. So birth control is in essence tricking the female reproductive system, specifically the ovary, into thinking we're pregnant. Because during pregnancy, there's high progesterone, high estrogen. And during pregnancy, you don't ovulate and you don't mature follicles. The last figure is kind of a new one for your book. It's in the later editions. I'm not going to spend time on this one because I think the previous figure did it. What this one kind of reiterates is some of the negative feedback controls, as well as some of this positive reinforcement control. But you can use this if you like to go over the reproductive cycle again. But I think that previous slide is the best way to work through the female reproductive cycle.